Hello everyone. Tonight we step into the dense darkness of Seattle in 1897, a place where opium isn't just a weapon, but a death sentence ticking by the second. This is the story of people forsaken by society, shadows wandering through the black night, and an addiction with no escape. Forget any illusions of salvation or triumph, because the truth is, you might not survive even one night in this cruel world. Before you lean back comfortably, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content I share, and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's fascinating to see people following from all over the world. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some background noise, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up in a room where the smell of opium has seeped into every fiber of the wood, every crack in the walls, and even into your burning lungs. The ceiling is darkened by smoke. There are no windows, only a sliver of light slipping in from the hallway outside, where someone just coughed up blood and then fell silent. Your hands are numb, stuck to the damp mat, as if your flesh has fused with the floor. Your body reeks of old sweat, cold ash, and dried urine. You try to recall what day it was yesterday, then laugh. The notion of what day is now just a luxury for those who still have a future. In your pocket, there's nothing but a smudged piece of paper and a bent coin. In the distance, a ship's horn sounds, a long, weary wail, like the groan of a city about to sink. You're in Seattle, 1897, a land where people flocked to chase Klondike gold, where the cunning became millionaires, and the weak rotted away in a dark opium den, as deep as a well's mouth. And you're no millionaire, you're a living corpse, barely clinging to life within the four walls of the underbelly, Chinatown, where Americans wouldn't dare set foot by day, but sneak into at night. You cough once, it's bitter. Your chest aches as if someone shoved a stone inside and poured tar over it. You fumble for the pipe, but it's gone. Maybe stolen, maybe you smoked it. Maybe there was never a pipe to begin with. You're not even sure of your own name, but you know this. The hunger for opium is rising, like a snake starved for 3 days, slithering up your spine. You need a hit, just one hit. Then you'll think later. If you can still think, if there's anyone left to think about, if you're still human. But humanity, by Seattle's 1897 definition, is a relative thing. And you, on that first day, when your shoes still had soles, your hair wasn't matted with grease, and your eyes weren't yet clouded, like the fog over the harbor, you thought you'd make it here. Just a few weeks, earn some money, unloading cargo ships, then head back home. Home? Yeah, that place with the brown tiled roof, the scrawny dog, and the sister who swore she'd never forgive you if you left again, like last time. But home has become a concept, while Seattle is all too real. You remember that day. It was raining. Not a torrential storm, but a persistent, damp, bone-chilling drizzle, as if the city was whispering into your bones. No one survives long here without leaving something behind. You followed a sailor from Vancouver who said there was cheap lodging in the lower district, where the yellow folks sleep, he said, then laughed loudly. You didn't laugh, but you followed. The slope down to Chinatown was slick as fish oil. The stone steps were cracked. The hanging signs bore twisting Chinese characters like writhing dragons, and shadows passed by quickly, as if they too were fleeing from themselves. No one looked at you, and you didn't know who to look at. You passed a pharmacy with a waving cat statue and a glass cabinet full of amber-colored jars. You passed a barber shop where razors were plunged into a tray of water like swords. Then you stopped in front of a red wooden door. No sign, just the faint sound of some instrument inside, like a zither with a broken string. The sailor knocked twice. The door opened. The first smell wasn't opium. It was warmth. A warm, sweet, inviting scent, like sleep after weeks of aimlessness. You stepped inside and all outside sounds were cut off. No more rain. No more ship horns. Just a velvety silence cloaking every sense. People in the room sprawled on woven mats. No one laughed. No one spoke. Each person was a solitary island in a sea of white smoke curling upward like morning mist in a cave. A man wearing an iron mask sat in the corner, intently heating an alcohol lamp. You looked at him. He didn't look back. The sailor placed a hand on your shoulder and said the last words you remember in his voice. First time, take it slow, but if you go fast, no one's stopping you either. He laughed, then vanished into the haze. A Chinese woman led you to a mat in the corner, saying nothing. Her eyes were deep as wells, her smile faint, as if she'd spent a lifetime watching others sink. You sat down, your hands shook, you heard someone vomit. Right after, a soft hiss, the sound of opium vapor passing through a porcelain pipe, and then a pipe was placed before you. Someone's hand, you couldn't see clearly, just the white pipe, a small lamp, a sweet smell, one hit, a rush, a slight stagger in your mind, as if you were wrapped in cotton and set adrift on a sea of tar. Everything slowed, then sped up, then shattered, then dissolved into dust. You laughed. For the first time in days you laughed. Then you slept. When you woke it was dark. You didn't know the time. You weren't sure it was the next day. You weren't even certain you'd actually woken up, because from that moment nothing was ever truly awake again. You asked the name of this place. The Chinese woman only smiled. She said, "No name. Once you're in, you don't need names anymore." You didn't understand, but you understood the feeling. The feeling of someone who'd started to slide and didn't want to stop. You left the opium den the next morning, if it was morning, and the outside world suddenly felt too big, too bright, too loud. You hurried back as if reality had slapped you. But the den was closed, the lamp was out, and you stood there in Seattle, under a light drizzle, your shoes starting to tear, your hands still shaking. And you realized this, you'd begun, and there was no going back. Not really, because even when the den was closed, the porcelain pipe was no longer in your hand, and the white smoke hadn't yet curled back into your lungs. That feeling, the soft, warm, endless sensation, still clung to every bone, every fold of your memory. You stood frozen in the street, in the rain, among busy passers-by who didn't bother to look. Everyone was in a hurry, grounded in reality, while you were slowly melting out of it. Not because you lacked the drug, but because you'd just found something truer than yourself. The memory of the first time you smoked, really smoked, slowly the way someone who's chosen this path does starts like this. 2 days after that evening, you returned to the narrow street, to the red wooden door. This time, no one led you. No sailor, no guide. You just knew you had to go back. It was like the pull of the tide, like instinct, like blood rushing to a wound. You arrived in the afternoon. Rare sunlight slipped through the clouds, casting a sickly yellow glow across the slick stone steps, as if the sky itself was nudging you to turn left. You knocked 3 times, hesitantly. The same old woman opened the door. She said nothing. Same look, same silence. She led you in, pointing to a woven mat near the back door, close to a wooden shelf holding tarnished bronze lamps. That day you weren't given a pipe right away. Instead, a young man, maybe Chinese, maybe Vietnamese, maybe a mix of many things, came over and placed a small tray in front of you. On it was a dark, tar-like lump of opium, soft and sticky, an iron needle, a wooden stick, and a white porcelain pipe. He didn't speak, just nodded slightly, and began the process. He placed the opium on a metal spoon, heated it over a small flame, then used the stick to slowly stir as the drug bubbled and melted. A sweet, burnt smell rose, not harsh as you'd expected, but like some deadly syrup, a scent that could make someone abandon everything just to chase it. You held the porcelain pipe and put it to your lips. The man nodded slightly. "Now," he said. "One word, one hit." You inhaled. The smoke went in like normal air, but when it reached your throat, you could feel every cell in your chest opening, as if they were breathing for the first time. No coughing, no choking, just one sensation. Ease, too much ease, the kind you knew couldn't possibly be healthy. You exhaled. The smoke curled upward like fog, thick and beautiful enough to make you want to cry, as the feeling spread from your jaw, to your neck, to your back. A sinking sensation, not falling, not dropping, but sinking, like being laid on a giant silk cushion in a windless ocean. No sound, no cold, no pain, no memories. All the voices in your head, the scolding ones, the pleading ones, even the anxious beat of your heart, vanished. In their place was a blank space, and in that blank space you lay still. You didn't know how long you lay there, maybe minutes, maybe hours. When you opened your eyes, it was dark. No one was beside you, only the porcelain pipe, still warm, as if you'd just exhaled your last breath and the world held it for you. That night, you didn't return to your lodging. You slept right there on the woven mat. No one chased you out. No one asked your name. You began to understand that the people here didn't care who you were before you crossed that threshold. They only cared if you were quiet, if you kept your mouth shut, if you knew the way back. The next morning, you woke with a heavy head, a throat dry as ash, and a mouth salty as seawater. But you felt at ease, as if all the usual pains of life had been temporarily lifted. Yet, what scared you wasn't the headache. It was the feeling that you wanted more. Not out of need, but out of longing. Not desperation, but obsession. The sensation of briefly flying out of your own body was too perfect, too fleeting, too real. You left the den when the sky was still grey. On the way back, everything looked different. Seattle was no longer a filthy, noisy place. It was like an unfinished stage where everyone was acting out an old script. The newspaper vendor smiled at you, as if he knew. The water carrier glanced at you, then turned away as if she'd seen you before. A child pointed at you and said something, but you didn't hear clearly. The world felt wrapped in cotton. That afternoon you went back. Not because anyone invited you, not because anyone pushed you, just because you knew you'd crossed a line. And now, you just wanted to fall a little further, to see where the bottom of this thing lay. If there was a bottom, if you didn't dissolve before reaching it. And so, you returned. The third time, the fourth, until you stopped counting. Stepping through the red wooden door became instinct, like yawning, like breathing, and like those things, you stopped thinking about it. It just happened. You were there. You smoked. You lay down. You woke. You stumbled out. You came back, over and over. But then you started to notice the opium den wasn't just the chaotic pit people rumored it to be. It was its own world. A system with rules, order, a clear hierarchy, but not the kind you knew from the outside. Out there, money ruled everything. In here, money was just the ticket to enter. Once inside, what kept you wasn't gold, dollars, or banknotes. It was silence, invisibility, the way you learned not to disturb others. In the den, no one spoke loudly. Talking wasn't even encouraged. Whispers had to be timed right. Every interaction was governed by a glance, a nod, or a slight wave of the hand. Where you sat was predetermined. There were no empty seats. If a mat was unoccupied, you didn't lie on it, because maybe its owner was just out back relieving themselves, or deep in a trance, their soul still lingering there. An unspoken rule protected that spot like an unburied corpse. You also learned that everyone smoked only their own portion. No one smoked for another. No one asked for more. No one touched another's belongings. The porcelain pipe, the metal spoon, even the cloth to wipe your mouth, they were territory. Crossing that boundary meant inviting trouble. A white guy once tried to steal a hit from an old Cantonese man. Just one hit. Before he could swallow, he was stabbed in the arm with a steel chopstick. No one intervened. No one called out. The old man kept smoking. The young guy writhed on the floor, groaned a few times, then crawled out the back door. You never saw him again. There was a strange order here, you thought.
And yet peculiar morality among fading souls.
They might have lost their names, their trades, their homes, but they hadn't lost their code. Here, no one stole from another, because there was nothing to steal, but everyone clung tightly to their own remnants. Smoke, sleep, and silence. You began to understand that the old woman wasn't just the madam, she was the keeper of the rhythm. No one knew her name. Some called her Moon, others, Sunken Eyes. She didn't give orders, but one look from her could silence the entire room. She didn't hit or expel anyone, but those who broke the rules disappeared, quietly. No one asked why, no one spoke of it, and no one was allowed to ask. You also discovered a chilling truth in that opium den. No one truly slept. They closed their eyes. They breathed slowly. They lay still, but in some sense, they were awake. Awake in dreams. Awake in delirium. Some whispered. Some tapped rhythms on their mats. Some mumbled songs in languages no one understood. Some laughed. Some cried without tears. And you, for the first time in days, began to understand why. Because you started doing it too. One night, Lying near the back door, you heard the soft shuffle of bare feet on the wooden floor. Opening your eyes, you saw a man, his face unclear, standing in the middle of the room, holding a hand-drawn picture. He didn't speak, just raised the picture, as if performing. It showed a burning boat on a black sea. Everyone else in the room kept smoking. No one looked, but you couldn't tear your eyes away. As he came closer, you saw a face in the picture that looked exactly like yours. He nodded. You blinked. He was gone. You asked the man next to you, a skeletal figure with long matted hair and hollow eyes, about the painter. He just laughed, spat out a piece of opium-stained tooth, and said in a raspy voice, "That's not for asking, it's for remembering." Then he rolled over and passed out, or rather sank away. You learned not to ask questions anymore. You learned to just watch, just listen, just remember, and keep those things in your mind, like small stones, ready to be discarded when reality started to crumble. In this den, there were rules, but no one spoke them aloud. You knew when to be silent, when to leave, when to avoid a mat, when to pretend not to see someone convulsing in the corner, when to bow to the woman carrying the lamp, when not to look in a mirror, if there was one. And one more thing, you knew that here, every soul had an expiration date. Once you started seeing other people's faces blur, not from the smoke, but because your own memory was dissolving, it meant you were fading too, not from the room, but from your name, your memories, yourself. As if this place didn't just consume opium, it consumed people. And by the time you began to understand that, you no longer cared, because you'd grown used to the silence, the rules, the blurred figures, not asking why, not needing a reason. You lay down, head resting on a thin pillow, hands still clutching the porcelain pipe, eyes half open, like someone waiting for the final train, one with no destination, no return ticket, and no one to see you off. And as you lay there, amidst the gentle rhythm of smoke and the creaking wood beneath, you began to realize you weren't alone, not in the warm sense of the word, not in the someone's by your side or someone understands way, but in the kind of loneliness that has witnesses. Around you, the figures lay like living corpses, each a story no one told, and when you looked long enough, closely enough, you began to see them, the nameless shadows, living quietly in that windowless opium den, like souls forgotten by time. The first you noticed was a man wearing broken glasses. Wearing isn't quite right. One side of the frame was gone, the other tied with a piece of twine. He always lay on his side, clutching a book with no words. After each hit, he'd open it, flip through the pages with two gnarled fingers, and smile as if he'd just read a familiar passage. Some said he was a professor from Chicago, fired after ruining a graduation ceremony by reciting Baudelaire in French while wearing a gown with no pants. But here, no one cared if it was true. He was just wordless professor, and everyone kept an arm's length away when passing by. The second was a black woman, maybe in her 30s, head shaved close, and always wearing a red wool cloak, no matter the season. They called her Sister Ruth, though no one knew if she was religious. Every morning, before anyone stirred, she'd rise, go from mat to mat, dip her fingers in a cup of water, and touch each person's forehead, whispering something that sounded like scripture, but warped, cracked like ice. Once you asked her why she did it, she just looked at you, her eyes empty, yet glowing like a bulb about to burn out, and said, "So y'all got a way back." You didn't ask again. You didn't know if she'd touched your forehead. The third was a Chinese teenager, small and so thin his collarbones jutted out like iron hooks. He always clutched a small stone dragon statue, carved so finely you suspected he'd been a sculptor, but he didn't speak English, and barely spoke at all. Except one night, when the room was asleep, he bolted upright, screamed a single Cantonese phrase, and bit his hand until it bled. No one stopped him. No one shook him. The next morning, he smoked calmly as ever, as if the night before was someone else's dream. You started calling them the silent ones. They were present, but didn't exist. They were there, but weightless. And every time you woke from a half-dreaming sleep, you saw them still in their places, on their mats, backs turned to the world, as if afraid that looking back would make them remember something unbearable. You began to understand why there were no mirrors in the den, because here, no one wanted to see their own face again. But not everyone was silent. There was a man whose laugh was worse than any moan. His name was Grady. At least, That's what you heard the first time he spoke to a wooden post, as if it were his ex-wife. Grady always laughed. When someone convulsed, when a corner of the den caught fire, when a body was dragged out, he laughed. A hoarse, echoing laugh, as if he'd discovered the universe's greatest joke that no one else could grasp. You tried laughing back once. You couldn't, because that laugh wasn't meant to be answered. It was just proof that some had gone far beyond the point of return. One time, you lay next to Grady. He turned, looked at you with yellow-brown eyes, and said, "You know what's funniest? We're all here, but none of us want to die. We want to live. We just don't know how to live anymore." Then he laughed again. You didn't sleep that night. Then, there was a woman no one named, an old lady, so ancient. Her skin looked like water-soaked paper, always wrapped in 3 layers of scarves, and only opening her eyes at midnight. No one saw her smoke, but by morning, her pipe was always empty. One night, you woke at 3 in the morning and saw her sitting upright, singing a German folk song. Her voice didn't waver, didn't miss a beat, as if her throat was the only thing still intact in her decaying body. And when the song ended, she lay down like a bird that had flown its last flight. Each person in that den was a question no one wanted to answer, and you began to realize the longer you stayed, the less you remembered their names. As if opium didn't just erase pain, it erased memory too. The stories you'd heard became fragments, the faces you once knew blurred in the haze, and you, among all these nameless souls, began to wonder, who would you become among them? You thought back to that first day stepping into this place, hands still trembling, eyes still bright. Now, your hands were steady, your eyes were clouded, you smoked without looking, you slept without dreaming, you woke without reason, and in a fleeting moment, you wondered who would tell your story if one day you didn't wake up. Would anyone mention you the way you mentioned them, or would you vanish, quietly, like a final wisp of smoke in a room too dark for anyone to remember? But then, that thought drifted away too, like everything else, because the alcohol lamp flickered again, the porcelain pipe warmed, and you inhaled, again and again, and the shadows around you, they were still there, not looking at you, not asking questions, just lying still, waiting for the next nameless train to roll through, carrying each silent soul further away from themselves. But there was one thing that neither the opium smoke nor the shattered slumbers could forever conceal: the sound of the Seattle police's hobnailed boots. You first heard it on a windy night. From the main door, where transactions were still greased with a few coins or a good stash of opium. But from the alley behind the den, it was a hard, steady sound, not the shuffle of a drunk or a lost wanderer. It was the rhythm of someone who knew they didn't need permission to step anywhere. And in that moment, you understood the police weren't coming to save anyone. Seattle in 1897 was a ravenous beast. The Klondike Gold Rush brought thousands pouring in, carrying money, sweat, blood, and every social disease imaginable. And with money flowing that fast, the police were just a formality in uniform. Those who could pay were left alone. Those who had nothing to offer, or worse, those no one would speak up for, became criminals with a single point of a finger. In Chinatown, criminal simply meant poor, unfamiliar, and knowing too much. You didn't know when you'd been added to their blacklist. Maybe after your 6th visit to the den, maybe after you accidentally took a pipe from the tray of someone who'd once been an informant, or maybe for no reason at all, because sometimes the police just needed to meet their monthly quota. Rumors spoke of a lieutenant named Larder Irish, his face always flushed, like his veins were about to burst. He was the one who handled dens that didn't share their cut. He didn't arrest you right away. He let you linger for a few days, like a cat toying with a mouse before snapping its neck. You started seeing his shadow at the end of the alley. Once he passed by you, tapping his billy club lightly on your arm without a word, as if to say, "I know who you are." One night, as you lay in a deep sleep from a heavy hit, someone pounded on the den's door, not knocking anymore, pounding. The sound of splintering wood, shouts, shoving. You tried to sit up, but your head spun like a broken axle. An oil lamp was knocked over, flames flickering in the smoke, and then they stormed in, 3 men in thick coats, leather gloves, faces as expressionless as statues. One yanked the pipe from your hand, another kicked you off the mat, The last one drove his iron-tipped boot into your chest. You didn't feel pain, just cold and nausea. You didn't resist. No one in the room did. Resist for what? To be labeled as resisting an officer, or to have your name splashed in tomorrow's paper under forced rehabilitation for violent addict. They didn't beat you to death. They didn't need to. They just wanted you to remember. You survived because they allowed it. The next day, the den was shuttered for 3 days. The old woman didn't appear. The boy with the dragon statue was no longer in his corner. Grady was barely breathing, his lips oozing blood, his eyes swollen as if someone had tried to rip his soul out with bare hands. You sat against the wall, clutching your stomach with only one sound in your head. We have no laws. Not really. In Seattle, laws were sold at the same price as opium. Those who paid more got their own version of justice. You once thought the police came to punish, but then you realized they came to clear the way, to ensure the remaining addicts didn't obstruct the money flowing into the city. The den was a necessity when the nights were cold, when bodies needed disposing. But when the city wanted to clean its face for visitors from Canada or San Francisco, people like you became trash to be swept away quickly. A week later, you were stopped on the street, just after leaving the fish market. They didn't ask your name, didn't need a warrant. They just tied your hands and shoved you into a covered horse cart. One of them whispered in a low, hoarse voice, "You know why, don't you?" You didn't answer, because you knew in this world, reasons always came after the blows. You were released after 13 hours. No paperwork, no charges, just tossed out beyond a brick wall in the dead of night, cold and hungry. But what they took wasn't time, it was illusion. You no longer thought you were invisible. You began to understand. You were watched, marked, and sooner or later, you'd either have to pay to keep living as a shadow or vanish, like those whose names no one remembered. And right then, you heard Grady's whisper from memory, that hoarse laugh thick with the smell of old blood. "We're here, not because we want to die, we just don't know how to live anymore." You returned to the den, but half your face was now bruised purple, your front teeth loose. The old woman didn't ask. She just handed you the pipe, and you smoked, not to forget anymore, but to escape. Escape the eyes beneath police caps. Escape the wailing horns in the night. Escape the truth that the police were no different from criminals. The only difference was, they were allowed to live in the light, and you weren't. And the light, however faint, no longer found you. After the arrest, the beating, being tossed out like a broken object, you stopped going out in the daytime. Daytime was for laws, random inspections, scrutinizing stares, and questions you had no answers for. You only moved when the sun went down, a shadow among shadows, drifting from one alley to another, seeking any place that would trade for a hit. But the hits were no longer easy to come by, because you were out of money, not almost out, or nearly out, completely out, empty. Not a single coin to trade for a scrap of opium, a few minutes of silence, a few hours of dreams. You started checking your coat pockets, your pants, rummaging through every small compartment in your tattered leather bag. All you had left was a dented zinc coin, a brass button, and a scrap of fabric that was once a handkerchief your mother gave you, or so you thought. Memory was starting to waver, teetering like the oil lamps in the den when the wind blew through. You weren't sure what was real anymore. You sold your only thick coat, sold your shoes, sold your leather belt, trading it for half a hit from an Irish cook who claimed he'd once made soup for a president. Maybe it was true. Maybe it was a delusion fueled by nightly smoke. When there was nothing left to sell, you sold what was inside your body. The wedding ring, not even sure whose it was. You pried off your finger and took to the flea market. The short man at the used jewelry stall looked at you for a long time. "You won't get much for it," he said, "because you look like a walking corpse." But he took it. In exchange, he gave you a small cloth bag, enough for 3 hits. You smoked one that night, another at dawn, and for the last one, the final hit bought with the ring that might have been the last keepsake of a life before you were swallowed. You inhaled deeply, long, as if trying to burn yourself from the inside out. You passed out on the cold ground. When you woke, you couldn't feel your legs. Cold, numb, part of you wanted to check if they were still there. Another part whispered, "If they're gone, it's less suffering." You dragged yourself to the den, but you weren't let in. The red wooden door had a new lock, The old woman no longer stood guard. Instead, a young man in a black coat, face expressionless, was there. He didn't say a word, just looked you up and down, as if calculating your odds of survival if pushed back out. Then he turned, closed the door, didn't even bother locking it. But you understood, no one needed to lock a place you were no longer worth entering. You sat outside the threshold all night, hoping someone would recognize you, but no one came out. No one went in. Just the sound of rain tapping on the torn brim of a hat you'd scavenged. You closed your eyes, trying to imagine another place, but all that appeared in your mind was an image of yourself, disintegrating. And right then, you knew, you weren't just out of money. You were running out of whatever humanity was left in you. You no longer felt hunger, no thirst, no pain, just emptiness, a kind of emptiness not in your stomach or throat, but in your chest, where your heart once was, where dreams once lived, where the thing called you used to be. You saw yourself reflected in a rain puddle, your face swollen, skin grey, eyes sunken, hair matted, like seaweed. A child passing by stared at you, then whispered to his mother, "Is he still alive?" And the mother pulled him away, so fast you heard her slippers skid on the sidewalk. You mumbled something, maybe an apology, maybe a plea for help, maybe nonsense. You weren't sure anymore. Your tongue felt like a heavy slab of meat in the wrong place. That night, you didn't smoke, didn't sleep, just sat, watching the darkness cling to the walls, watching Seattle like a beast dozing and wheezing through its chimneys. You thought about how much of a person could be lost before they stopped being human. Eyes, voice, hands, or was it when others looked at you and no longer wondered who you'd been? And then you knew the last piece of your humanity wasn't your voice or your memories, it was your capacity for shame. And tonight, you no longer felt ashamed because you no longer felt anything, didn't need to, didn't want to. You stood, limped away, leaving a piece of your body on that doorstep. No one stopped you, no one called you back, and you didn't look back either. No one remembered your name, but now, maybe, you didn't need to know it either, because to this city, you were no longer a person to be called by name. You were a warning, a living example, a shame for others to point at and turn away from, relieved it wasn't them. And that's when they dragged you into the light, not to save you, but to display you. It started with a newspaper article, page 3, bottom right, under local social conditions, nameless addict causes chaos near fish market. The illustration was a blurry sketch of a skeletal man, disheveled hair, lifeless eyes. You recognized yourself, though no one named you. Below was a short, sharp description. He muttered incoherent words, cursed passers-by, and tried to crawl into a pharmacy. No one asked you. No one asked why. The next day, you were arrested, not quietly in the dark like before, not thrown into a cart like trash, but dragged out in the street, in broad daylight, during the busiest market hours. A policeman in a bright uniform, white gloves, grabbed you by the collar in front of a crowd of laughing children. He didn't curse or hit you, just gripped you like a filthy object, and turned to the crowd. Anyone doubting what opium's doing to this city? Look here. Laughter erupted. A child threw an apple at you. You didn't dodge, it hit your cheek, soft and sticky, but you didn't react. A woman covered her nose, scoffing in disgust. A man whispered, "He looks like a sick dog," and you, dragged along like a circus animal, knew this was your official performance. The jail that day didn't lock you in a cell, they left you in the hallway, where everyone passed by. A young guard came close, nudged your leg with his boot and laughed. Heard you were a teacher, or a doctor, or nothing at all. He didn't need an answer, because you no longer had a voice to give one. After 2 days you were released. No reason, no paperwork, just suddenly pulled up and pushed out the door. But this time, no one waited for you at the gate. No one was there. No den opened its doors. No old friends. No porcelain pipes. No silent shadows. Seattle had seen you, used you as a cracked mirror, reflecting the city's darkest depths, and now discarded you. You shuffled back to Chinatown, hoping to find the old place. But the red wooden house was gone. In its place was a new barber shop, its sign in English. The old woman was gone. The boy with the statue was gone. Grady might be dead, or laughed until he vanished into the smoke. You sank to the curb, trying to imagine another world, a place where you weren't a living proof of depravity. But no matter how you pictured it, you always returned to the same image. You in the street, being dragged away, like a glitch. The city didn't know where to hide, except in the public's gaze, because you understood now. Seattle needed someone like you, not to pity, not to help, but to look at you and feel okay about themselves. You were a statistic in the city's speeches. Look what opium can do. You were the image in warning pamphlets, handed out at schools. You were the story a father told his son to scare him away from the half-breeds in the lower district. You were a mirror, not to reflect, but to frighten. You tried wandering to the church, where white ladies once handed out charity porridge. But as you stepped inside, the pastor looked up, his eyes freezing like ice. Sorry, the church is under repair. You heard the sound of intact wood, hymns echoing from behind the door. But you said nothing. You just turned away, because you knew they weren't lying. The church was being repaired, its image, its conscience, repaired to have no place for souls like you. You thought about leaving the city, but where? You had no money, no papers, no strength, no name, just a bad reputation, a shadow etched into society, like a photograph taken by others' eyes. You sat in the park, where golden leaves fell on your shoulders like a thin layer of dirt, waiting to bury you. Children played a few meters away. A mother pulled her kids back when they got too close, whispering, "Don't go near, he's an addict." You didn't react, didn't get angry, didn't feel embarrassed, didn't hurt, just sat there. That's when you realized the last piece of you, the remnant, after honor, dignity, and even survival instinct had melted away, was the part society needed to keep as an example, a side character in someone else's success story, an unwilling witness to what they called civilization. You bowed your head, gave a faint smile, not out of joy, but because everything was finally clear. You weren't anyone. You were just something for others to look at and learn their lesson from, and then turn away, like they all had, turning their backs on you, on the breathing wreckage they once called human. But your body didn't turn away. It stayed with you, a brazen traitor, demanding, writhing, speaking up every time you tried to stay silent. And on the night when the last scrap of opium was scraped from your torn pocket, when even the fading breath of hallucination dissolved like smoke in the wind, your body began demanding the only thing it believed was worth living for one more hit, just one more. You thought you'd endured before. You'd gone 3 days without smoking, maybe 2. Either way, you survived. But that was surviving in smoke, living off the afterglow of a previous hit. Now, you were empty, clean in a way that terrified you. 24 hours passed without a single crumb of opium, no hint of hope from a street dealer or a kind addict dropping a scrap. Your head began to ache, not the pain of sun or sleeplessness, but a dull, grinding pain, like someone scraping your brain with a wooden spoon. Your eyes watered, not from emotion. Your eyeballs were shrinking, as if trying to crawl into your skull to escape the light. You trembled. Your fingertips twitched. Your tongue stuck to the roof of your mouth like it was glued, and you began gasping air through your teeth, as if it could replace the lost smoke. They say addiction is craving, but craving is too light a word. You didn't crave anymore. You were desperate. You wanted to claw the pavement, dig up some black speck that might be opium resin. You rummaged through trash piles, flipped over rags, sniffed broken pipes. Once you found something stuck in the base of a post, black, slimy. You brought it to your nose, not opium, cat feces. You vomited, but nothing came up, because your stomach was empty, your gut folded like an old sack. You lay there, in an alley corner between 2 buildings. Rain began to fall, thin and cold. No one looked at you. A rat scurried over your hand. You didn't flinch. You just whispered, "Give me one hit." You spoke to the rat, to the darkness, to yourself. Then you started seeing things. Not beautiful hallucinations, not dreams, but fragmented images. The man in the iron mask from the den, the girl with the dragon statue, the old woman singing in German. They appeared, blurred, then vanished, then reappeared. You saw your mother, not the mother you remembered from childhood, but an aging mother, crying, pointing at you, and saying something in English, though she'd never known the language. You were pulled into a vortex. It felt like falling into a bottomless pit, but instead of dark it was blindingly bright, bright enough to sear your mind. bright like hospital lights. You groaned. No sound came. Your throat was ash. Your hands scratched at your skin. You weren't looking for opium anymore. You just wanted this to pass. But it didn't pass. It only changed shape, from headache to dry heaving, from trembling to convulsing, from fear to utter emptiness. And in the moment just before dawn, when the city was still asleep, you heard footsteps, clear, slow, heavy. You opened your eyes, or thought you did, and saw a man watching you from the end of the alley. Long coat, gloves, eyes gleaming like winter water. He didn't smile, just watched. You weren't sure if he was real or conjured by your drug-starved brain, but you knew one thing. If he'd offered a pipe right then, you'd have crawled to him, at any cost. You'd have sold whatever humanity remained, sold your shame, sold your soul, but he offered nothing. He just walked away, and left you, a twitching heap of flesh, lying there, trembling, screaming in silent agony, for 24 hours, that felt like forever. But forever doesn't exist in Seattle, at least not for people like you. A few days later, when your body began reacting to life again, as if jolted awake from a prolonged trance, you found a new name whispered in the black market, the sealed room. No one called it an opium den outright. No one gave directions, but in the cryptic words of a dried coconut vendor, in the averted gaze of a girl weighing fake tea, in the half-smile of a cook who brewed moonshine with peppermint oil, you pieced it together. There was another place, a place not meant for you, but a place where the opium was real, uncut, no raids to fear, no bodies rolling dead on mats. There, opium was a ritual, a privilege, a high-class pastime lit by silver lamps and inhaled through polite smiles. You didn't know what brought you to that door. Maybe a final stroke of luck. Maybe you looked broken enough that no one thought you'd be clever enough to steal. Or maybe someone among the rich wanted a touch of raw reality in their evening of furs and perfume. You stood before a 3-story red brick building north of First Avenue, its windows always shut, curtains always drawn. No sign, no bell, just a man in a vest standing like a statue at the entrance. When you approached, he didn't ask who you were, just nodded slightly, and you were in. Inside was another world, high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, thick carpets that muffled every step. No heavy smoke, just a faint vanilla scent, tinged with cedarwood. People didn't sprawl on the floor. They sat, straight-backed, in suits, long dresses, polished leather shoes. They smiled, spoke softly, poured wine into crystal glasses thin as breath, and they smoked, not from porcelain pipes, but from carved ivory ones. A white woman in a red velvet dress invited you to sit. You didn't know what to do with your dust-caked hands or torn knees, but you sat. Before you was a silver tray with tools, everything clean, gleaming, no chipped edges, no old bloodstains. An older man with slicked-back silver hair turned to you, raised his glass, and said in a refined voice, "Welcome to where misery is wrapped in silk." You didn't understand what he meant, but you nodded. When the first wisp of smoke filled your lungs, you nearly wept. Not because it was strong, but because it was clean, too clean. No tar taste, no dirt, no grit. Your body reacted as if reuniting with a lover, separated by decades. You felt like you were dissolving, but this time, not in pain but in peace. You didn't collapse on the floor. You didn't need to bite your sleeve to stay conscious. You just closed your eyes and breathed. When you opened them, a large mirror stood before you. You saw yourself sitting in a room full of beautiful, polite, educated people. You saw yourself as an ink stain in a gilded scene, but no one chased you out. No one said anything. They smiled, as if you were an essential part of the game, as if your decay made them feel cleaner. You heard them talk about art, theater, railroad stock prices. A blonde woman asked where you went to school. You lied. Yale. The room laughed, not mockingly, but as if you'd said something endearing. A man poured more wine into your glass, and you drank, then smoked, then drank. The hunger in you subsided, not because it was satisfied, but because it was soothed by soft velvet, gentle voices, and fragrant smoke. That night, you slept in an armchair. For the first time in weeks, you weren't cold. No smell of blood, no cries, just soft music from a gramophone in the corner. The next morning, you woke, were offered breakfast, scones, coffee, soft-boiled eggs. A young man escorted you out. Not a word of contempt, not a pitying glance. But as you stepped back onto the trash-strewn, windy street, its groans surrounding you, you looked back and saw something vanish from your eyes. Gratitude or self-respect. You weren't sure. You only knew one thing. You'd just stepped into paradise. But it wasn't meant for you. It was a place for others to see you. And remember that hell still existed, and they, thankfully, didn't belong there. You coughed softly, a drop of blood in your throat. And you realized, the cleaner the opium, the filthier the return to reality. You turned away, not looking back, because no one opens the door twice for the same ghost, and you knew you'd been granted a single glimpse, not to change your life, but to remind you that another world once existed parallel to the one where you were slowly dying. You walked on, back to the old alleys, where the smell of opium rose thick like a freshly unearthed corpse, where the midnight groans no longer made anyone turn their heads, and where the only person who still remembered your name, though you weren't sure it was your real name, was Dead Ghost. No one knew his real name. He was the only one who smiled at you when your hands shook, taking your first hit. He was the one who gave you a scrap of opium when you were kicked out of the den for being broke, even though he barely had enough for himself. Dead Ghost was thin as a stick, his face long, his beard patchy, his lips always cracked with a wound that never healed. He spoke little, smoked much, and always sat in the same corner of the old den, a place that had mysteriously vanished after last month's raid. You found him again in an attic room of an abandoned laundry shop. He lay there, on a torn quilt, no lamp, only moonlight filtering through a broken roof tile. You didn't need to ask. He raised his hand, pointing to the pipe and spoon already set on the floor. You sat down, filled the lamp, rolled the opium onto the needle, and lit it. The green flame flickered in his eyes, dimming and fading as you passed the pipe. He took a hit, slow, deep, silent, as if he were trying to hold on to life with every last wisp of smoke. You saw his hand tremble, not the tremble of withdrawal, but the tremble of a snapped string about to break. He didn't cough, didn't vomit, just sighed, and gripped your hand. A light, gentle grip, as if he no longer had the strength to hurt. "I dreamed," he said, his lips stained with blood. "Dreamed I was still human." You didn't reply. You just squeezed his hand back. A little, another hit, then another, but that last hit, you didn't know exactly which one it was, took him entirely. He exhaled, long, light, and didn't inhale again. You waited. 5 seconds, 10, then a minute. You placed your hand on his chest. No pulse, no breath, nothing, just warmth. You didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't shout, just sat there, beside a corpse. You sat until the moonlight retreated from the roof tiles, until the first morning call of a boozy vendor echoed from the street below. Then you leaned down, closed his eyes. His eyelids were soft, thin as incense paper. You gathered the tools, wiped them clean, placed them neatly in the corner. You didn't know why, habit, or a desire to preserve some final shred of dignity for him. Then you stood, pulled the torn quilt over his body, and quietly walked out. No one knew, no one asked, no one cared. He vanished from this world the way other addicts did. No funeral, no prayers, no name on a stone, just a cold gust sweeping through the attic, carrying away a soul too tired to beg to stay. You never returned there, not out of fear, but because you knew, after Dead Ghost's death, you had no one left to return to. No one to share a hit with. No one to say something in the silence, just to remind you that you still existed. You smoked alone, lay alone, slept alone, and from then on, you began to count, not days, but the gaps between seeing someone you once knew and the last time you heard their voice. Those gaps grew shorter, as if everything was shrinking, as if the world was collapsing into just you and the unnamed corpses. And you knew, deep in the hardened fibers of your flesh, death wouldn't come by knife, gun, or police. It would come through the complete disappearance of anyone who ever saw you as human. And now, the last one was gone, taking your name, your memories, the thing that once set you apart from the smoke around you. And when that final piece vanished, the city began to shed its skin, not with a storm, not with a fire, but with something crueler: silence. One early winter morning, as you dragged yourself through the familiar street, You noticed the lanterns no longer hung from the eaves. The smell of stir-frying was gone. The sound of children speaking Cantonese, the laughter of betel nut vendors, the chop of meat, the creak of slamming shutters, all stopped, as if someone had unplugged the entire neighborhood. Chinatown went dark. No one announced it. No one explained, but you felt it. In your skin, your nose, the voids in your eyes with nothing left to cling to. The den where you once lay was gone. The row of houses was boarded up, plastered with red paper, bearing the cold seals of city authorities. The old woman who ran the den, nowhere to be seen. The boy with the dragon statue, gone too. The familiar faces, the shadows that once slithered past you in the haze, had vanished as if they'd never existed. You asked a water carrier at the street's end. He shrugged, said nothing. You asked a vegetable vendor. She turned away, clutching her basket, walking quickly, as if you carried a plague. You began circling the area. Every nook that once hid a secret room, an entrance to a den, a half-open iron door, was now locked. The only traces left were dried bloodstains, torn scraps of handwritten notes, and the averted gazes of those who survived by knowing to stay silent. That night, you found no shelter. You slept behind a cold furnace near the railway, head on your arm, body curled like a cat doused in water. In your dream, the whole neighborhood burned, not with red flames, but white, cold fire, smokeless fire. It devoured the memories you'd held, devoured dead ghosts' name, devoured the last time you knew who you were. You woke in the middle of the night, throat parched, eyes unable to close. You walked toward the last unboarded alley. There, behind a cracked concrete wall, you found a narrow path to a basement. You'd once heard dead ghosts say this place was used to hide liquor during Prohibition. Now it was the only thing left. You pushed the door. The smell of mold, dead rats, leaking liquor, and opium. Someone had been here. Someone was still smoking. And you, without thought, without choice, crawled in, as if you were the last remnant of a world being erased from the map. In the basement's darkness, there were 4 people. No one spoke. No one laughed. They were like mannequins, cloudy eyes, greenish skin, stiff hands, but alive, and they let you sit. Didn't ask where you came from, didn't ask your name, didn't ask why, just silently lit the flame. A porcelain pipe was passed to you, and you smoked, not to escape, not to forget, but to exist. The smoke entered, not smoothly. It was sharp, harsh, as if the city itself had seeped into the opium, now burning you from the inside out. You shuddered. The person beside you coughed. Another slumped to the side, not getting up. But no one reacted. No one stirred. You closed your eyes, breathed slowly, thought of the lantern-lit street that once led you to your first hit. Now it was dark, not because of night, but because the city had deliberately turned it off, as if to erase Chinatown from memory, to make way for French restaurants, porcelain shops, new rental apartments for white folks from San Francisco. And you, and those like you, were the trash to be swept away in the urban renewal. You knew it, and in the fleeting moment between breaths, you also knew you weren't surviving in the ruins. The ruins were surviving in you. You were the ruins. You were the part of Chinatown they hadn't yet demolished. You were what would rot, not in a blaze, but in a silent death, in a nameless basement, in odorless smoke, in memories no one wanted to recall. And when your very presence became something others shunned, you understood in Seattle, 1897, you didn't need to do anything wrong to be arrested. You just needed to exist in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the wrong form. And you, with sunken eyes, grey skin, a body folded like a broken shadow, were the perfect embodiment of the fear this city was trying to scrub clean, with new paint and replanned streets. That morning, you dragged yourself from the basement, throat scorched, head spinning, vaguely hoping some Chinese porridge shop hadn't been shut down. But before you reached the street's end, a policeman in a long coat crossed the road, blocking your path. He didn't ask for papers, didn't question you, just looked you up and down, snorted, and said coldly, "You look like you're up to something." You stood still, not understanding. And that was your first mistake, because when you didn't react, they took it as admission. 2 more officers appeared, as if sprouting from the ground. One kicked your shin, just enough to make you stumble but not fall. "Don't you hate it?" he asked, not needing an answer. His hand twisted your arm behind your back, tied it with leather, and you were dragged off like a spoiled package they were tired of tossing into storage. The police station was a grey stone building near the port, smelling of fish and bleach, truth and lies intertwined. You were locked in a cramped, windowless room, where voices from the hallway echoed like dream talk. No one asked your name. No one said what you were arrested for. You sat there, hands still bound, mouth bitter, heart beating slow, as if waiting for official orders to stop. 1 hour, 2, then 3. When an officer returned, he carried a folder. Flipping through pages, he raised an eyebrow. Unidentified vagrant, previously detained, seen at a disturbance scene. He looked up at you, smirked. You look suspicious enough to lock up. You don't need to do anything wrong. You just need to be you. You didn't reply, because you knew he was telling the truth. Not because he had a conscience, but because the law no longer bothered to pretend. You were held overnight. No mart, no water. No one asked anything more. At dawn, you were dragged out. Another officer, younger, acting compassionate, gave you a piece of bread, hard as brick. You didn't eat. He said, "You should be grateful there's a hearing today." But the hearing wasn't in a courtroom. It happened on the sidewalk outside the station, in front of 2 reporters and a fat judge who'd just finished breakfast. No jury, no lawyer, no clear charges. The judge glanced at you, then wrote in his notebook, 30 days for vagrancy, with signs of instability. Signs of instability. The way your eyes stared at nothing. The smell of opium smoke still in your hair. The thin, unwashed hands. The fact that you were alone, with no one to vouch for you. Your invisibility irritated the uniformed men. This jail wasn't like the others. Not that there was another bad enough to compare. You were shoved into a small cell with 2 others. A black man with broken teeth and a crazy old man giggling as he bit his nails. They didn't look at you. You didn't want to look at them. The smell of mold, bodies and despair caked the walls like mildew. No one talked. No one slept soundly. The black man whispered in the night, "I'm here for wearing my hat too low." Cop said I was hiding something. Hiding what? Nothing but an empty head. You didn't reply. You were trembling lightly. Your body was reacting to the lack of opium. Your head exploded. Your arms stiffened like wood. You screamed in your throat, but no one heard, because these 30 days weren't for rehab. They were for you to understand in the authorities' eyes. You weren't an addict. You were evidence. Evidence that Seattle was cracking down, cleaning up, purifying the city. And if anyone asked what they were cleaning, they'd point to you. A living corpse, white-eyed, grey-skinned, nameless, without defense, without anyone to care. And that was enough. For 30 days, you lived like a rodent. Ate scraps, slept sitting, breathed air through your fingers. You started talking to yourself, not because you were mad, but because it was the only sound that didn't scare you. On the 30th day, they released you like a rat let loose in a market. No one looked. No one stopped you. You walked away, not turning back, not knowing where you were going, only knowing one thing. You weren't arrested for doing anything wrong, but for looking like something society wanted to hide. And now, you were released back to the darkness, to keep existing as a reminder no one wanted to repeat. But what remained in you after 30 days in that stone-cold cell wasn't memory. It was scratches, not wounds you could wash and bandage, but scratches from within, from your spine outward, as if something parasitic lived in your chest, trying to claw its way out with every breath. Prison didn't kill you with a knife. It didn't need to. It stripped layers of your humanity by forcing you to watch yourself rot, among others decaying. Some nights, you sat curled in a corner, hands clutching your head, hearing the old man in your cell whisper to the wall, "We don't die from hunger, but from being remembered too much." You didn't know who he was talking to. Maybe himself, maybe someone long dead. But when you looked at the wall where his hand rested, you saw fingernail marks, long, deep, webbed like a spider's trap. Some were worn, as if scratched over days. Others were fresh, gouges of flesh not yet dried, red as truth. You didn't dare count, didn't dare touch. But every night, you looked, not out of curiosity, but because it was the only thing that made you believe those who'd been here wanted to escape too. You began dreaming the scratches grew, crawling off the wall, burrowing into your skin, paving the way for terror to take root. One time, you woke to find your nails caked with blood. You'd scratched something, maybe the wall, maybe yourself. You weren't sure, Because in those days, you weren't you anymore. You were a lump of trembling flesh, surviving on the delusion that if you could still remember someone's name, you wouldn't be swallowed whole. But you remembered no one's name, except one dead ghost. And maybe that's why you hadn't died yet. In your final days in jail, you discovered something horrific. Everyone here had their own scratches. Some scratched the wall, some scratched their legs, some scratched the air, nails leaving trails in the dim light. No one spoke of them, but everyone knew. It was the only way to prove you still existed. You scratched with your right hand until your pinky bent crooked. No one bandaged it. The guards glanced and noted, subject exhibits self-disruptive behavior. Disruptive? To whom? To your own corpse. You laughed. The first time in weeks. A dry, hollow laugh, like bones clattering in a cave. But then you stopped, because you remembered this place had no laughter, only whispers, the drum of pulsing blood, and the sound of scratches growing longer each day. On release day, a guard handed you tattered clothes, ill-fitting shoes, and a look like he was returning a stray dog to where it fell from. You didn't greet, didn't thank. You stepped through the cold stone door, the glaring light making you wince, but no tears fell. You couldn't cry anymore. You looked back at the prison wall one last time. There, on the second-floor windowsill, was a scratch longer than any you'd seen. It was like a crack in your memory, reminding you that some left their souls here, nameless, and you now carried them all in your heart, not out of nobility, but because you were the only thing left that remembered they'd existed. You shuffled through the streets, fingers swollen, back hunched from time and fear. Each time you looked at your hands, you saw cement dust still clinging to your skin, nails still holding bits of crumbling wall. But the worst pain wasn't your broken finger. It was the feeling that, though you'd left the prison, you were still caged, in your own body, in a name no one called, in a past rotting slowly, each night, through invisible scratches. And you knew, though the prison gates had opened, you weren't truly free. You were just released to die somewhere else, a place where death came slower, quieter, and perhaps more painfully. But your body didn't care about metaphors. It was crumbling, demanding the only thing it still remembered: opium. Your throat burned dry, as if sand filled your lungs. Your skin changed color in patches. Your teeth wobbled like rotten posts before a collapse. And at some point, when you vomited blood and lacked the strength to wipe it, you dragged yourself to the only clinic in the neighborhood you still remembered. Not because you believed a doctor could help, but because you needed someone to confirm you were dying. The clinic was an old wooden house, tucked among streets erased from the development map. The doctor was a middle-aged man, sparse chin whiskers, his once white coat now yellowed like old paper. When you walked in, he wasn't surprised. He didn't ask why you came. He just looked you up and down, his gaze like he was examining a lab specimen about to fail. He sat you on a wooden bed, shone a light, listened to your heart, tapped your stomach lightly. You said nothing, didn't need to. He knew immediately. 10 minutes later, he let out a short breath. Not pitying, not cold, just the sound of someone too used to the end. Then he spoke, his voice like prescribing medicine for a rainstorm. Incurable. You stayed silent. He looked at you a moment longer, then jotted in his notebook: total systemic failure, chronic infection, bronchitis, nerve damage, suspected from long-term opium use. This case should be left alone. You heard that last part without fully understanding. Left alone? What did that mean? No treatment? Waiting for death? Letting your body destroy itself from within? You asked without words, just looked at him. He met your gaze with eyes that had seen many like you, and watched them silently vanish from the streets like shadows after rain. You need food, he said, clean water, rest. But what you need most is something I don't have. You need to go back to before you started. You laughed, a hoarse sound like a cough. I don't remember where I started. He nodded, not smiling. Neither do I remember ever saving anyone. He handed you a small cloth bundle. Inside were a few painkillers, a vial of antiseptic, and a scrap of paper with the name of a relief shelter south of the city. You didn't take it, not out of pride, but because your hands shook like they'd been shocked, and you knew you'd drop it all before reaching the door. The doctor tucked the bundle into your coat pocket, helped you stand, then opened the door without looking back.
You walked.
Not because you wanted to, but because no one held you back. On the way, you opened the bundle, stared at the pills like they were mistaken toys. You didn't swallow, not because you weren't in pain, but because you understood no pill in there could cure what afflicted you. You weren't dying from disease, you were dying from being forgotten, because no one saw you as a creature worth saving. They saw you as a consequence, a proof, a warning to society. And now, even the doctor confirmed you were incurable. That night, you didn't return to the basement. You wandered through nameless streets, collapsed beside a trash bin near a grocery, back against the wall like an exhausted animal. A man passed, paused for a few seconds, then left. A child ran by, throwing you an empty glance. You closed your eyes, tried to imagine who would bury you if you died tomorrow. The answer came instantly in your heart. No one, because you weren't a person who could die with ceremony. You were just a body to be swept away like garbage, shoved into a pit, covered with a little dirt, and forgotten on a rainy day. And you thought, maybe that was right, because no one could cure a shadow, especially a shadow that had lost its human shape. But Seattle didn't lack those who believed a shadow could be pulled back into the light, with leather straps, prayers, holy water, and the trembling hands of priests aiming to save the world one soul at a time. And that's how you ended up at the rehab camp. Not willingly, nor court-ordered. You were just sitting there, in the rainy night, at a lampless intersection, when a silver-haired woman approached, knelt before you, placed her hand on your forehead, and whispered, "God is still waiting for you to return." You didn't understand, but you let it be, because it was the first time someone touched you without hitting, chasing, or checking your pulse. She led you to an old covered cart. No one tied you, no one asked your name, just the sound of wheels rolling steadily over wet slopes, and the smell of rotting wood mixed with cinnamon from the handkerchief she gave you to wipe your face. When the cart stopped, it was dawn. The rehab camp was in an old monastery, perched on a fog-covered hill. No sign, no grand gate, just stone walls, a thick wooden door, and white-painted windows with curtains never drawn. The woman handed you to a man in a brown robe, hair shaved close, eyes deep, hands scarred. He didn't introduce himself, just said, "This is where you'll be saved." You said nothing, because you didn't believe, but you didn't leave either, because your legs no longer had the strength to walk further. The first day, they gave you warm water, a bowl of thin soup, and a private room with a wooden bed, unlocked, but you couldn't leave, because the craving for opium returned like an enemy who knew every corner of you. You thrashed on the bed, banged your head against the wall, ground your teeth until they bled. Each time you screamed, a monk would come, sit at the door, and read prayers, not approaching, not intervening, just reading, word by word, breath by breath, as if binding you with sound. By the third day, you were truly restrained, hands tied to the bed frame with soft leather straps, not painful, but humiliating. And when you convulsed, groaned, begged for a scrap of opium, they didn't yell, they just prayed louder. Once you vomited blood and bile, your body cold as a corpse. A monk lifted you, placed you in a hot bath, washed you with licorice-scented soap, and dried you with linen towels. No one hit, no one scolded, but no one looked at you like a human either. They saw you as a soul, being dragged by demons. And you, in your fever, began to wonder, if you weren't human, who was the demon inside you? The second week, they started taking you to the chapel. Every morning, at 6 sharp, the bell rang. You and the others, 18, young and old, walked in a line, hands clasped, sat on long benches, listening to the priest preach about redemption. You didn't listen, because your head still buzzed, like flies in your skull. But you sat, because you had no choice. At every meal, they made you pray. Every night, they made you confess. And though you couldn't remember what you'd done, or who you'd been, they said, confession is the first step to forgiveness. You confessed you'd smoked, that you'd scratched walls, that you'd wanted to die. They nodded. They said, God hears, but you heard nothing. Just the wind whistling through door cracks, and your heart beating like a ferry drum. The third week, you stopped trembling when you went to bed, but you still dreamed of pipes, still smelled smoke, still saw Grady laughing, saw dead ghost lying still, saw Chinatown burning with colorless fire. You told a monk about it. He nodded, said, "Your soul is being purified. Keep going." But you knew it wasn't purification. It was reenactment. Memories repeating, because they were the only part of you not yet dislodged. One night, you snuck out of your room, not to escape, but to sit in the courtyard, in the night fog, looking at candle-lit windows, and you cried, not loudly, not sobbing, just leaking like an open wound. Because for the first time in months, you realized you could still feel defeat. The next morning, they put you in an isolation cell. No one hit you, but they tied you up for 4 more days. No opium, no prayers, no words, just you, leather straps, and unanswered prayers. When they untied you, they asked, "What do you see?" You answered, "Nothing," and they smiled, as if that was a sign of recovery. Hard, you knew nothing, was death taking root in your palms, a death needing no knife, no opium, just the slow forgetting of how to want to live. And the rehab camp, with its leather straps and prayers, was the place that made that easier than ever. Because when you began forgetting how to want to live, your body forgot how to sleep. And so it began, 10 days without sleep, not the sleeplessness of sadness, restlessness, or glaring lights, but a kind of insomnia from deep in your spine, where every nerve screamed like a mistuned violin string. Your body lay, but your eyes wouldn't close. Your eyelids were heavy as lead, but your brain blazed like a summer lake. Each time you closed your eyes, images danced like broken film reels. Fire, smoke, Grady laughing, dead ghost curled up, the old woman nodding at the threshold, police slamming batons into your back, the doctor saying incurable, and leather straps, scarring your wrists forever. The first night you counted the chapel bell chimes echoing in, each one an hour apart. You counted 12, then 12 more, then 12 times 3. No one called you to eat. No one dragged you to prayers. A monk only tapped your door each morning, asking, "Are you still okay?" You didn't answer. Couldn't. Because in your head, black snakes slithered over each other, whispering in a language you'd never heard. They didn't hiss. They whispered, and you trembled. The third night, you saw streaks of light crawling on the wall. No candles, no windows, yet light was there, greenish, thin as a blade, gliding past your eyes. You turned, faced the wall, but the light still burned the back of your neck, like someone watching. The fifth night, you started talking to yourself. Not loudly, not meaningfully, just fragmented syllables. Sometimes names, sometimes non-existent words. You heard yourself and knew it wasn't your voice, but the voice of someone who died in this room and hadn't left. You tried sitting up, but your head was heavy as stone. Each movement made your ears ring, like you were submerged underwater. You scratched your face. To stay awake, but warm blood didn't comfort you. It only added a metallic tang to air, already thick with sweat, dread, and broken faith. The sixth night, you saw your mother. She stood in the room's center, not old, not young, not clear, just there. Her eyes gleamed like mirrors. She said nothing, but you knew she was crying. You crawled out of bed, knelt on the floor, gasped, "I'm sorry," but she dissolved like smoke before you could reach her. And in that moment, you knew you'd apologized for something you didn't remember doing. The seventh night, your bed began to breathe. Not metaphorically. You felt the wood beneath you pulse like flesh, each breath making you want to scream, but you didn't. Because if you screamed, you feared the things in the walls would hear, and you began to fear the walls, the smooth grey walls, with cracks like claw marks, the way shadows slid along the bed's edge, like a watchful animal. You stopped closing your eyes, because each time you did, you saw fire, not hot fire, but cold, the fire that burned Chinatown in your memory. You kept your eyes open until your corneas dried. Your eyes were red, not from sleeplessness, but from crying without knowing you cried. The eighth night, a monk entered. He stood silent for a long time, then placed a hand on your shoulder, whispering, "God doesn't sleep, but humans need to." You turned to him, eyes wild, and whispered, "I'm not human anymore." He didn't argue, just squeezed your shoulder lightly, and left. You sat there, alone, with the green light, the dreamlike blade, the eyes unclosed for over 180 hours. The ninth night, you heard footsteps, not in the hallway, but under the bed. a rustling like tearing fabric. You didn't dare move. Each breath you held, afraid of waking something, crawling just below the floor. You lay rigid until dawn, and when sunlight seeped through the door crack, you saw your hand was clutching dried blood. The 10th night, you laughed, silently, a soundless laugh, not from joy, but because you understood, sleep had abandoned you like everything that once loved you. And in that moment, you didn't need sleep anymore, because you'd entered another state, where there was no boundary between waking and dreaming, living and dying, remembering and forgetting. The next morning, they took you outside, into the fog-covered courtyard. They said, "Today you'll get some sun." You sat under Seattle's pale winter light, head tilted back, eyes no longer reflecting. And for the first time in 10 days, you drifted off, not because you were healed, but because your body, finally, was too exhausted to resist sleep for one more second. But it wasn't human sleep anymore. It was the sleep of a soul wrung dry, floating in the void between forgiveness and oblivion. But forgetting never lasts, because in Seattle, even when you've become a nameless corpse, someone will still come to shake you awake, not to save you, but to shove you back into the grind. And the next morning, you woke on the wooden bed in the rehab camp, wrists still marked by leather straps, eyes open but no longer seeing. A monk entered, handed you a cup of water, placed a hand on your forehead, and whispered softly, "You fought well." You didn't respond, because you didn't believe you'd fought. You'd only survived by dying piece by piece, and as he left the room, a thought slipped into you like smoke leaking through a wall's crack. If you didn't leave this place now, you'd never leave at all. You didn't know if it was instinct, resistance, or just a tiny remnant of life refusing to fade, but you knew you had to escape. On the 11th night, when the chapel bell rang to signal bedtime, you quietly tiptoed into the hallway. Each step echoed in your heart. The camp was built of stone, its corridors, long like a maze, iron doors locked tight. But you remembered one thing behind the kitchen. There was a wood storage room, with a rotting wooden floor, and a damp smell. You'd been punished with cleaning it once. You recalled a vent hole at the base of the wall, leading to a pitch-black pit. Back then, you thought it was a wine cellar. Now, you prayed it was an escape. You crawled through the kitchen's half-open door, gently pushed open the wood storage door, and were hit by the stench of mold. You pulled up floorboards, hands trembling, heart pounding like an alarm drum. And then you saw it, a sewer grate, black iron, no cover. Below was darkness, no light, no moonlight, just the stink of sewage and rusted metal. You didn't think much. You slid down, your head hit the iron rim, your back stung, your knees scraped, but you didn't stop. The sewer was freezing. Filthy water reached your ankles, rats scurried over your feet, like tiny shadows. You groped forward, hands clinging to slimy walls, the stench assaulting your throat, until you nearly vomited. But you didn't stop. Each step was a refusal, of leather straps, of prayers, of pitying looks. You didn't need redemption. You needed escape. You went 10 meters, 20, then reached a fork in the sewer. You didn't know which way led out, but instinct told you to turn left, where a faint hum of wind echoed. Oh! You crawled, scratched, slipped, until your head hit a barrier, a grate. Above was an iron cover. You pushed. It didn't budge. You braced yourself, strained both shoulders, your vision blurred, and finally, the cover lifted a crack. You emerged like a corpse rising from a grave, gasping as if you'd never breathed before. Seattle's night was cold, but not as cold as the sewer's depths. You lay back on the street, chest heaving, eyes on a starless sky. You'd been born again, not through prayer, but through the will of someone refusing to be buried while still breathing. You dragged yourself off the road, found an empty alley, sat against a wall, hands and feet caked with sewage, body reeking like rot, but inside you was something strange. Silence, no more bells, no more prayers, no more voices telling you to be saved. You sat there until dawn. No one asked where you came from, no one noticed you'd been gone. Seattle didn't remember, but you did. Every crawl through the sewer, every scrape on the walls, every moment you wanted to stop and let the sewer swallow you. And because you didn't, you knew from now on, every breath was yours alone. Not the opium's, not God's, not the doctor's, just yours. And though it was foul, painful, hopeless. At least it was real. And in a city full of pretense, that might just be enough to call freedom. But freedom, for someone like you, was just a slightly longer chain. Because just days after crawling out of the sewer, hands still swollen, eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness, you shuffled back to the only place that ever felt, not warm, but familiar. The opium den. Not because you needed the drug, but because there was nowhere else to go. The old alleys were still there, but they'd changed color, more trash, colder winds, and the silence in passers-by's eyes heavier than before. You passed walls that had heard your moans, doors where hands once reached out with pipes, and finally, you stood before the red-painted door you'd been kicked out of 3 times. This time, no one guarded it, no sound, no light. The door was ajar, like a gaping mouth, inviting not with words but with smell. The first smell wasn't opium, it was death. A smell you couldn't mistake, the stench of human flesh, decaying in the dark, mixed with opium ash, salty sweat, and dried blood. You hesitated, but stepped inside. The interior was black as a tomb. No oil lamps, no coughing, no whispers, just air thick with death, and the sound of your footsteps echoing like a stranger's boots in a graveyard. You walked the familiar hallway, touched the moldy walls, stopped at the first room on the left, once a gathering spot for 4 or 5 addicts. The door wasn't locked. You pushed it lightly. A gust of cold air hit your face like a breeze from hell, and then you saw him. A man lying on his back on a mat, eyes wide open, mouth agape, skin glossy like melted rubber. No one had closed his eyes. No one had tied his jaw. He lay there, alone, like a sacrificial offering, left after the devil's feast. You recognized him, not by name, but by the torn shoes you'd seen under a table one hazy night. He'd laughed with you once, shared a hit. Now he was rotting where you'd once lain. You didn't scream, didn't run. You just stood, eyes fixed on the corpse, a single thought ringing, my turn's coming. And then you realized the smell of death wasn't just from him. It spread from other rooms, from the hallway, from the attic. You groped through other rooms, and what you saw was buried silence. Some bodies lay on their sides, some clutched pipes, some were curled as if praying. No one cleaned, no one reported, no one knew, or if they did, no one cared. The den had become a graveyard without tombstones, and you were the last living soul to cross its threshold. You slumped to the floor beside a corpse with dried blood around its nose, not from fear, not from sadness, but because, in a strange moment, you felt peace. Peace because no one beat you here, no one tied you, no one forced you to confess. Just corpses, and you, and air free of prayers urging you to be saved. You thought of lying down, closing your eyes, letting your breath dissolve into the smell of death, becoming part of the room. But then, from deep in your memory, an image rose, dead ghost's eyes, when he gripped your hand and exhaled his last. There was something in his eyes you couldn't let fade. Faith? Regret? You weren't sure, but you knew if you lay down now, even regret would have nowhere to cling. You stood, slowly as if the weight of the death stench held your legs. You left the room, the hallway, the dead house. And when you pushed the door open, stepping into the grey afternoon light, you didn't feel like you'd survived. You just felt you hadn't died yet. And sometimes, in a city that had rejected you, that was enough to keep dragging toward the next darkness. Because in a city long dead in your heart, every step was a test to see if you were still human, or just a shadow waiting to be blown away. But the city wouldn't let you be, because people like you, penniless, pale-faced, trembling hands, dark-ringed eyes, breath reeking of old opium, were seen as a plague. And if you didn't die on your own, they'd help you. It started with a man in a leather coat, wide-brimmed hat, stepping out of a tavern at the end of Front Street. He didn't look at you like a human. He looked at you like spoiled goods, a walking pestilence. You were just sitting, leaning against a wall, doing nothing, saying nothing. But his gaze pierced like a needle down your spine. Then he whistled. From behind him, 2 more figures appeared, not in uniform, but you knew the type. Bounty hunters, not hunting to kill, but to clean like sweeping trash, catching stray dogs. You, one said, got papers. You didn't answer, not out of defiance, but because you had no papers, no name, no address. Vagrant, he concluded, turning to the man in the leather hat. This kind disappears nicely. You stood, hands limp, legs unsteady, but you knew, if you stayed, you wouldn't be taken anywhere bright. You turned, walked, not fast, but resolute, and the sound of footsteps behind you pounded like a hunter's drum. You ducked into one alley, then another, stomach empty, head spinning, but your heart raced like during the March raids. The footsteps behind didn't stop. They echoed, closed in, then fell silent. You knew what that meant. They'd split up. One circling ahead, one trailing, one climbing a roof. You didn't run anymore. You crawled, squeezed through a narrow gap between walls, slid down a crumbling stone staircase, stumbled into an old basement once used for smuggled goods. In the dark, you held your breath, gripped cold pipes, listened. The wooden door above slammed open. Boats thudded down steps. Heavy breathing. He descended slowly, like a wolf, knowing its prey was near death. You pressed yourself to the floor, swallowing your heartbeat. Then, a kick. The board you hid behind flew open. Light from an oil lamp hit your eyes. He saw you. You lunged, not to fight, but because your last shred of survival instinct flared. Your bodies collided, fell. You bit his hand, drawing blood. He howled. You rolled out, tripped, but kept crawling. An arm grabbed your coat, then let go when your elbow smashed his face. You ran, not knowing where, just knowing you had to. Past the fish market, over the wooden bridge, through a narrow alley reeking of sewage. Each shout behind was a countdown. You reached the familiar brick wall in old Chinatown, where a tea shop once stood, now just dust. You pounded the door. No answer, but a small hand cracked it open. A Chinese child looked at you, then said nothing. Gesturing, you slipped in. The door shut. Silence. The footsteps outside rushed past, then faded. You collapsed on the dirt floor, gasping, mouth dry as sand. The child didn't ask anything, just handed you a bowl of water. You drank, eyes stung, from the cold water, from being alive. A moment later, when you opened your eyes, the child was gone, and you knew this place wasn't safe either. Not for long. They'd find you again, because in Seattle, no one let a shadow wander too long. If not the police, then the bounty hunters. If not for the law, then for the peace of mind of those living clean. You looked at your hands, the bounty hunter's blood still under your nails. You didn't wash it. You just slumped, head on your arm, knowing the hunt hadn't stopped. It had only just begun, because every time you escaped, the city sent a clearer message. You don't belong here. You have no place. You're not wanted. And as you lay on the cold dirt floor of the room behind old Chinatown, heart still racing from the chase, you knew no one would hide you for more than a night. Even pity had its limits. And when those limits were crossed, all that remained was bargaining. The problem was, you had nothing left to bargain with. No money, no name, no labor value, no intact body, but you still had one thing: yourself. And when someone like you, someone who'd lost everything, reached the final dead end, the doors locked with scripture began to open with claws. That's how you met him. They called him Mr. Rye. No one knew his real name. No one knew where he came from. Only that he was someone neither police nor gangs dared touch. He didn't sell drugs, didn't run women. He just solved problems. And that night, when you were kicked out of the room behind the market, before you could warm up, you heard his voice for the first time. You need a deal. He stood at the alley's exit, tall, in a long black coat, hands gloved. His face was hidden under a hat's brim, but his voice, low, steady, clean as a blade, scraping bone. You didn't ask how he knew you, didn't ask why he came, because in your eyes then, the only question was, what's it cost to live? He led you away, not to a carriage, not to a house, but underground. A steel door opened in the middle of a shuttered packing shop, leading down a cold stone staircase, where the smell of blood mixed with ink and rotting paper. Below was a windowless room. On a table, a folder, a pen, a vial of purple-black ink. You won't starve, won't be hunted, won't need to hide, he said. In return, you work for me. No questions, no refusals, no forgetting. You looked at him, and you knew he wasn't joking. In Seattle's underworld, no forgetting was the scariest part. It meant even if you die, the deal holds. You signed, not because you understood, but because you had no choice. And when the pen touched paper, you felt your heart skip, as if part of you was blotted out, sealed, stored in an unlocked drawer. The first job came the next morning. You were given a cloth sack. Inside, a porcelain pipe, a razor blade, a wad of old cash, and a scrap of paper with a name. Lee Chan, 28. Unpaid debt. No instructions. No directions. But you understood. You went, not with hatred, but with an emptiness so deep that action had no morality. You found Lee, a man just a few years older, once a dockside vendor, now hiding in a cramped room, under a staircase. When you arrived, he knew immediately, not from what you said, but from your eyes, no longer bright like the living. He cried, begged, offered everything he had. 2 silver coins, a broken jade piece, a letter unsent to Guangdong. You took it all, not because you wanted to, but because it was the only thing keeping you alive. A few more days. When you returned, Mr. Yerd didn't ask questions. He just nodded and gave you your first meal in months. Bread, chicken soup, hot tea. You ate, trembling as you ate, not from cold, but because you knew every survival now came at the cost of another's soul. Every night you slept, someone lost their home. Every cup of tea you drank, someone vomited blood. You became an arm of the darkness. No knife, no gun, just presence. A reminder, you owe hell, and now you're the bill. Once you were sent to clean an abandoned opium den. Inside, bodies were scattered like wilted grass. You gathered them, wrapped them in mats, pushed them into the sewer. No one stopped you, no one asked. Another time, you were sent to cut power to a pharmacy. 3 days later, the owner killed himself. No one came for you, no one came for him. Just a brief newspaper line, suspected financial stress, and so you lived, not hungry, not cold, not hunted. But each night, when you saw your face in a street puddle, you saw someone else, no longer an addict, but not human either. Just a creature surviving by snuffing out the last light in others' eyes. And that was the price. The price of freedom in a city without mercy. A deal you couldn't undo, because what you traded wasn't just your soul, it was the right to die human. But then the sky decided to claim its share, not with fire, not with flood, but with snow. And that year's snow in Belltown wasn't like ordinary winter snow. It came thick, sudden, and so cold that time seemed to freeze with each falling flake. You remembered that day clearly, because the morning sky over Seattle was gray as lead, and winds from Puget Sound sliced through the streets like blades. Snow began falling near noon. At first, just small flakes, drifting like lime dust. But by afternoon, the city was blanketed white. Roofs sagged as if about to collapse. Familiar alleys vanished under snow, up to your ankles. And people like you, no home, no hearth, no door, could only curl up in narrow passages or crawl into abandoned freight cars, hoping to survive another night. But you weren't just a vagrant anymore. You were Mr. Wise Man, and so you were given a special task. Find a guy named Hal, skipped to debt, hiding in Belltown since last week. He can't die from the cold. He has to be found by us, not nature. You didn't ask why. You just knew it was how you proved loyalty, how you survived a winter without light. You started tracking Hal through newsboys, small grocers, snow-buried shacks. Everyone just shook their heads or pointed vaguely, until you found the first clue, a strange pair of shoes left near a water station, beside footprints leading to an abandoned lumber mill on the hill. You followed, wind howled in your ears like a wraith's wail. Each step was a battle, the snow knee-deep, your coat barely better than a thin blanket. But you kept going, not because you wanted to, because you had to. When you reached the mill, night had fallen. The door was ajar, snow creeping inside, frozen into hard mounds. You pushed it open and saw him. Hal, huddled in a pile of sawdust, tattered coat, holding an empty whiskey bottle, eyes open but seeing nothing. He wasn't dead yet, but he wasn't alive either. You stepped closer, He didn't react. You shook him lightly. Hal, he flinched, looked at you. His eyes narrowed, then widened. It's you. You didn't know if he recognized you or was delirious. You pulled him up. He was too light, like a straw husk. You carried him on your back through the snow, step by step, toward Mr. P's lair. Under the dim moonlight, you and he were like two lost mannequins. But inside you was another storm, because in that moment, carrying a dying man through the white winter, you remembered the first corpse you saw in the opium den. And you wondered, did he know he was about to be handed over like a debt? Did he know the one saving his life had sold his own soul just to keep breathing? You weren't sure, but you kept carrying, kept walking, until the familiar steel door opened and Hal was taken into the darkness. You felt no relief, just cold, colder than any wind that ever grazed your skin. Because you knew this year's snow didn't just cover the city, it buried the last line between survivor and betrayer. And now you were both. A survivor in nameless ice, and a betrayer of the last human part left in your soul. But then, one foggy afternoon, when the snow had melted into grey puddles flowing through street gutters, and the city's smell returned to smoke, rot, and sorrow, you heard it. A melody, faint, old, a singing voice thin as thread, coming from the second floor of a forgotten house. You stopped, not because the song was beautiful, but because you knew it. That melody, you'd heard it your first night smoking, lying on the den's floor, before you knew how the world would slide. Back then, you thought it was your mother's song. Now, you knew it was human. You climbed up. The wooden stairs creaked under your feet like old bones. At the end of a narrow hall was a half-open door, behind which sat a figure by a window. An old woman, white hair spilling long, worn sweater, hands clasped as if holding the last bit of warmth. She sang not for anyone, not to perform, not to be heard, but as if whispering to a lost soul. Only she remembered. You stood there, not entering, just listening. The song was in an old tongue, maybe Gaelic, or some European dialect you didn't know, but you understood the feeling. You heard it in the tremble of her throat, in each pause for breath, in how she stared through the dusty window without blinking. After a while she turned, not startled, not afraid. She just nodded. "Come in," she said in old, soft English, like ash. You stepped inside, didn't ask, didn't explain. She didn't ask who you were, just said, "Sit down, the wind out there bites." You sat. You both looked at each other for a long time. Then she spoke. "I had a son once. He sang this song to me. Then he left, and the snow that year was as white as this one." You stayed silent, not because you didn't know what to say, but because you feared if you spoke, everything you'd buried would spill out like blood. She continued. "They said he was an addict, said he stole, said he abandoned home. But I know, he still remembered me, because no one forgets the song they sang to their mother." Your eyes stung, because you didn't remember your mother singing anything. Or maybe she never did, but you knew that feeling, the longing to believe someone out there, dead or gone, still held a piece of you in their heart. "I keep singing," she said, "so if he's alive, he'll know the way back." You didn't know why you stayed, only that each note of her song tore through a layer of ice in your chest. You started talking, not everything, but enough for her to understand, about the alleys, the hunger, the opium, dead ghosts' death, the den, the jail, the leather straps, the man named Y, the people you had to betray. She didn't cry, didn't judge, just took your hand. Her hand was dry, bony, but warm. A warmth not from blood, but from memory, like a fire, kindled from the ashes of the past. "You're not a demon," she said. "You're just someone left behind." You buried your face in her hands, didn't sob, didn't wail, just stayed silent, letting her hand stroke your hair like a forgiven child. And in that moment, you understood why she sang, not to call her son, but to keep her own soul from turning to stone while waiting. Before you left, she pressed a piece of paper into your hand. On it, the song's lyrics written in trembling script. "If you forget everything," she said, "remember at least one line. So even if you die with a song." You walked out. Belltown's sky was grey, but in your pocket, that song was the only thing alive. And for the first time in months, you didn't feel hunted anymore. You just felt there was still a path to return to, even if, perhaps, no door remained open. But in your world, where hope was as rare as light in a dark room, salvation sometimes came from the unlikeliest and darkest places. That was the doctor's clinic, the one you'd thought might heal, or at least offer some comfort. But the man you met wasn't like any doctor from stories. He had no kind eyes or gentle words. Instead, he carried the air of an executioner in a white coat. When you stepped into the narrow room, the sharp smell of antiseptic filled the air, choking you. The doctor stood there, silently observing you from head to toe with eyes cold as ice. He didn't speak right away, just motioned for you to lie on the cold examination table, where life and death seemed separated by only a thin layer of skin. You felt the tension in the air as he pulled out sharp, cold medical tools and vials of medicine that made your heart feel like it might stop. He began examining you meticulously, listening to your lungs, checking your pulse, inspecting the wounds on your body. Each time he touched you, a sharp pain stabbed through you, not just in your body, but in your soul. After a while, he sat down, sighed, and looked at you with eyes both pitying and cold. "Your condition is severe," he said. "Long-term damage, your nervous system is wrecked, your lungs are critically weak, and above all, the opium addiction has eaten away what's left of you." He paused, then continued, his voice devoid of hope. "I won't lie to you. Cases like yours, modern medicine has no effective cure. At best, there are temporary measures, prolonging life in pain." You looked into his eyes, searching for a spark, a shred of hope, but all you found was stark, undeniable truth. He handed you a prescription for painkillers and a few experimental detox drugs. "You can try them, but don't expect much," he warned. "This isn't salvation, just delay." You took the pills in hand, feeling their coldness like your own fate. Leaving the clinic, you felt like you'd just passed through death's door, the line between life and death, thin as paper. You knew everything you'd been through, and would face, wasn't a story of healing, but a journey toward accepting an approaching end. Yet you kept walking, carrying those pills like heavy stones on your back, both burden and crutch. You no longer knew where you were going, only that each step was a battle against yourself, against nameless pains and hopeless despair. In the city's cold, dark night, you looked up at the starry sky, wondering if anyone out there was praying for a forsaken soul like you, or if it was all just endless silence, swallowing every last shred of hope. The months that followed saw you wandering through Seattle's streets and tangled alleys, carrying the weight of an uncertain existence and the support pills the doctor had given you. Your body was still weary, tormented by pain, and with every breath, you felt the fragility of that so-called salvation. Then one morning, as the sun hadn't yet fully risen, you sat on a cold brick step, eyes fixed on the faint light piercing through the early fog, and for the first time in months, you felt it, a true spark of light. Not the blinding glare you'd feared upon waking, but a gentle, soft light seeping through the cracks of your hardened soul. You didn't know if it was chance or a miracle, but that light was like a promise, a reminder that even as your life was fading, there was still something to cling to hold on to. You began to notice small changes in your body, a lighter cough, a deeper sleep, an odd calm when the morning dew settled on your tangled hair. No magic healed your wounds, but there were fleeting moments when you felt you hadn't been entirely forgotten. One day, a stranger handed you a bowl of hot soup, not from a diner, but from a small shelter for the abandoned. The woman standing before you, with kind eyes, said this light was a gift of compassion in a cruel city. You weren't sure if it was true or just a dream, but you ate as if it were the only thing keeping you from vanishing completely. At night, you sat alone on the steps of an abandoned church, watching the stars fade and thinking about your life. The months wrestling with darkness, the hunters, the nameless shadow demons. You remembered Dead Ghost, the widow and her old song, the smell of opium in the den, and the sound of footsteps in the sewer. And in that moment, you realized the last light wasn't the sun, not the light of the rehab camp or the cold clinic. It was the light within you, a tiny, fragile flame that never went out. No matter how many times you wanted to snuff it, that flame still burned. And as you stood, walking through Seattle's thick fog, you knew your journey wasn't over. Though the path ahead was full of thorns, you still had a reason to keep going. That last light, the flame of life not yet extinguished. And with it, you stepped toward a tomorrow, however dim, that might still be waiting. But in a transforming Seattle, those small sparks of hope were often swallowed by realities harsher than you imagined. Not long after you felt that light within, you were brought to a new rehab program, an experimental medical trial the city promised would change lives like yours. It wasn't the dim rooms with leather straps and disheartening prayers, but a place lit with blazing gas lamps, nurses, doctors in white coats, and tools straight out of science fiction. You were introduced to morphine, not to addict, but to detox, a paradox you couldn't deny. Each day, you were injected with increasing doses of morphine, combined with other support drugs and therapy sessions, led alternately by priests and doctors. You didn't believe in change, you didn't believe in promises, but for the first time in so long, your body stopped convulsing violently. The craving eased, and the tormenting pain lessened. You began to sleep a few hours, though not fully. The therapy sessions were a mix of sermons, stories of sin and forgiveness, interspersed with hymns sung in the room. You lay there, listening, sometimes drifting, sometimes so awake you felt like a stranger in your own body. You heard talk of salvation as a vague concept, a dream for those with strength left to believe in miracles. You wanted to believe, but the pain and past still chased you like an inseparable shadow. One afternoon, you were taken to a small courtyard behind the clinic, where faint sunlight filtered through ancient trees. You felt the sun's warmth on your skin for the first time in months. It was a strange moment, both gentle and painful, because you realized you were alive, but also slipping away. Each dose of morphine was a step forward, but also a step back, a drift away from yourself. In the days that followed, you faced yourself, your fears, your mistakes, the memories you tried to bury under smoke and drugs. You cried, you laughed, you screamed, and you fell silent. The doctor said it was the healing process, that everyone went through it. You weren't sure if that was true, but you knew one thing: you'd never been more alone. Then one day, in a rare moment of clarity, you stood before a mirror, staring at bloodshot eyes, a pale face, and premature wrinkles. You realized that no matter how hard you tried, the wounds on your body and soul wouldn't fade overnight. Too, you were still you, or at least what was left of you before everything dissolved. And you wondered, was this the final salvation, or just a program to prolong painful days? But whatever the answer, you kept going, kept living, because as long as that last light flickered, you couldn't let go easily. But living through those endless days, you realized something just as painful. Some people never truly die. They aren't granted rest in peace, nor can they escape the death that comes as a mercy. You, in your delirium and sleepless nights, had become one of them, a person who doesn't die. One blurred afternoon, as the evening light fell through the rehab clinic's window, you heard a whisper in your head, not your own, but a strange, low, cold voice, like winter wind through ancient cracks. "You cannot die," it said, unprompted. You flinched, looking into the void, but no one was there. Just the darkness settling in. You felt its presence like a shadow demon, tracking every breath, every step, every heartbeat, not yet stilled. That wordless, formless last will echoed in your mind. You cannot die, because you made a deal, because you paid a price, because you're still in debt. You lay there, hearing the clock tick, each sound pounding in your head like a verdict. You knew the life you held was just an unpaid debt, an unfinished path, a game without end. You wondered if anyone out there heard your whispers, if anyone understood the horror of being trapped between life and death, unable to end the journey though you wanted to. You recalled those who went before, Dead Ghost, Grady, the widow with her old song, and the nameless shadows in the den, jail, rehab. They too were people who didn't die, living in oblivion and darkness. You felt you weren't alone in this misery, but that didn't lighten the weight on your shoulders. You realized the price of continuing to breathe, to walk, was carrying the pain of those gone, bearing secrets you couldn't share, accepting eternal loneliness. And in a fleeting moment between waking and dreaming, you whispered to yourself, "If I cannot die, how will I live?" That question had no answer, but it urged you to keep going, if only to find a sliver of peace in life's endless storm. You sat up, eyes wide, staring into the darkness ahead, where anything could happen. knowing the journey was still long. And though you couldn't die, you didn't yet know how to live. But you would learn. You had to, because it was the only choice left. Then one day, in the haze between life and death, you woke, not in a familiar room, not in the dim light of the rehab clinic, or the darkness of shadowy alleys. You woke in a morgue, no human sounds, no breathing, just a silence so cold, it made your heart seem to stop. The sharp smell of bleach filled the air, mixed with the scent of cold earth, and bodies gone stiff. You lay on a steel table, skin icy, your body no longer feeling pain, but caught in a state between waking and dreaming. You stared at the stark white ceiling, the harsh neon light straining your eyes. You wanted to cry out, to scream, but no sound came. Your hands wouldn't obey. Your eyes were open, but couldn't blink. You were a living corpse, trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead. Then slowly, memories flooded back, the months battling addiction, the arrests, the relentless pain, and that last light you'd seen. You remembered Dead Ghost, the widow singing her ancient song, the chases through darkness. But now, you had no strength to cry or lament. You could only feel a loneliness deeper than ever. Then, you saw a figure enter the room, a man in a white coat, stern-faced, eyes cold, but not cruel. He leaned close, placed a hand on your forehead, feeling the faint warmth left. "Awake are you?" he said, his voice low and warm, but detached. You tried to respond, but only managed a heavy breath. He looked at you longer, then said, "Not many get this chance. Not many come back from here." You wanted to ask why, but couldn't speak. He continued, "You're on the edge, between life and death. You're one of the rare cases we can't explain." In the days that followed, he visited often, bringing scraps of paper, pens, writing tools you didn't know how to use. He told you to write, not to recount, but to hold on to the human part left in you. You tried, with trembling, incomplete strokes, but it was the only way you stayed connected to the outside world. In that cold room, you learned the most painful truth. Life wasn't just breath, but memory, story, the mark you left on the world. And you feared you'd vanish completely if no one remembered. One night, with only the clocks ticking in the room, you heard a faint sound at the door. It cracked open, and someone in a white coat stepped in. Not the doctor, someone else, someone you couldn't tell was alive or dead, real or hallucination. They leaned down, looked at you with deep eyes and whispered, "This isn't the end. You've still got a long road ahead." You didn't know if it was encouragement or a curse, but you knew, in that moment, you'd been given another chance, not just to exist, but to find yourself among life's fragments. And as faint light from the window fell on your pale face, you promised yourself, no matter what life held, no matter how dark the coming days, you wouldn't let yourself vanish completely. You would write your story, not as an addict, not as a failure, but as someone who lived, tried, and rose from the coldest ashes. But in a city like Seattle, where life and death stood so close, not everyone could choose their path. You, despite all your trials, still felt like the last parasite, clinging to the breath of a city not meant for people like you. You weren't alone. In the streets, in the shadows, there were thousands like you, survivors by unease, by unspoken deals, by accepting to be shadows for others. You realized you were becoming part of that machine, a rusted but indispensable cog in its cruel grind. The months passed, and you were no longer the one deciding your life. You were driven by invisible commands, from Mr. Wath, from those who owned the night, from the insatiable hunger in your chest. You were given tasks, completed them, then left in a trash-filled, sewage-soaked alley, waiting for the next order. You became your own shadow, existing not for yourself, but for things you'd never fully understand. Some nights, as darkness fell, you stood still before a puddle on the sidewalk, seeing yourself reflected among countless dim lights. Your face was no longer clear, blurred by smoke and rain. You wondered if anyone still remembered your name, if anyone would tell the story of someone who walked through this darkness, who survived the bleakest days. You knew the answer was no, but that didn't scare you, because you'd learned one thing in this world: surviving was a victory. Existing without being erased was a miracle. And so, you kept going, kept being the last parasite, clinging to every breath, every step, every cold, indifferent glance. Because when you had nothing left to lose, existence was the only gift you could receive. You didn't know where you'd end up, didn't know if the future was yours, but you knew, parasite or shadow or part of the dark, you were still moving, and in every step, you held on to something small, a belief in a tomorrow, however dim, however uncertain, where you might find a way out, and with that belief, you kept living, kept walking, kept fighting, even if no one saw, no one remembered your name, even if you were just the last parasite in this cold Seattle. But the world kept turning, and in the ceaseless swirl of time, a new era began to dawn, an era of change, though perhaps not for people like you. Opium, which you'd hidden to smoke in the dark, now appeared in a new form, licensed, prescribed, a legal remedy in fancy clinics and grand hospitals. The city and health organizations, once indifferent or oppressive to people like you, began to see addiction as a medical issue, a condition to treat rather than punish. But that change didn't reach every corner of Seattle. In the streets you wandered, in the dark rooms where smoke still lingered, opium remained a weapon of survival and the darkest deals. But outside, a new light shone, clinic signs sprouted, effective detox, banners hung everywhere, promises of a new life without hiding in shadows. You saw the rise of doctors in crisp white coats, managers of detox centers, funded charities helping addicts. But the difference between this new era and the old wasn't ease, it was complexity. You saw people like you, once rejected, treated like animals, pulled into the new medical system. Some found light, but others lost themselves in rigid protocols, constant monitoring, and the loss of the freedom they'd fought for. You wandered between two worlds, the old shadows and the new era of hope. And sometimes, in the haze of prescribed doses, you heard echoes of those who came before, the nameless shadows from the den, jail, rehab. They reminded you that change was needed, but never enough to erase the past. You looked at your hands, still scarred, bearing the marks of a life of endless struggle. You knew you couldn't go back to the past, but couldn't fully step into the future either. You lived in that borderland, between light and dark, life and death. And one rainy afternoon, walking through busier streets, where pharmacies prescribing opium sat beside upscale cafes, you felt an indescribable choke. Opium was no longer the weapon of society's outcasts, but a legal product, a therapy for physical and mental pain. But you understood one thing. For you it was still what you'd fought to escape, what made you a shadow of yourself. You sat on a step, watching people pass, and thought in this new era, was there still a place for people like you? Would anyone remember the shadow that dragged through dark alleys, or was it all just a forgotten piece of a city trying to clean itself? But deep down, you held on to that tiny flame, the flame of life not yet out, of hope however faint, that one day you'd be more than a memory of darkness, but part of the light. And with that thought, you stood, walked on into a path with no clear end, where the new era unfolded, full of promises and challenges for those who dared to live and hope. But in a new city, where skyscrapers rose, where technology and wealth became symbols of power, you were no longer human. You were a living corpse, not a walking dead, but a corpse of the past, of fragments discarded in the darkness the city didn't want to see. You walked through wide streets, where neon lights and billboards blazed, hiding the night sky, but you couldn't hide the rotting smell of yourself. You saw others, shadows in tattered coats, empty gazes passing without touching. You didn't know how many times you were ignored, seen as an invisible object, non-existent, but you were still there, walking, breathing, living, as a remnant that couldn't be erased. The city changed, with luxury shops and expensive cafes pushing out the slums and dark alleys you once knew. But those alleys didn't vanish completely. They retreated, waiting for other shadows to follow. You felt part of this world, but didn't belong. You lived in a borderland between light and dark existence and oblivion. You were a blend of what was and what couldn't change. Some nights, you stood under dim streetlights, watching the rush of people, cars passing like waves, and wondered if any of them saw what you were. A living corpse in a vibrant, thriving city. You knew you were part of a history no one wanted to remember, a story no one wanted to tell, but you couldn't vanish completely. Not when your memory was etched in every brick, every old door, every opium-scented breath of the last den. You told yourself, forgotten or rejected, a living corpse in the new city. You were still here, still walking, still breathing, and still living in your own way, in your own world. But Seattle, the city you once called home, named with tired, desperate sighs, didn't truly forget you, nor did it remember. You were a shadow between blinding light and deep darkness, a faint trace in newly paved streets, glittering skyscrapers, the laughter and hurried steps of countless nameless others. The city kept you like an unspoken secret, a repressed memory no one was allowed to revisit. You weren't in history books, no statues or memorials. No one sang your name in the city's songs or told your story in conferences. But the stones beneath your feet, the corners you'd passed, whispered your story. The story of someone who fought, wrestled with darkness for a fragile spark of light. You were part of a past that couldn't be erased, though covered by time's dust and oblivion. When people passed you on the sidewalk, they didn't see you. They looked through you like cold air, like the shadow of a sad day. But you stood there, still breathing, and you understood that in a changing city, people like you were the last witnesses to what was, things people didn't dare see, didn't want to remember. One night, you stood by Puget Sound, watching lit ships leave the harbor, carrying the city's new dreams. Cold wind brushed your face, the sea's salt waking you slightly. You thought of those who crossed your life, Dead Ghost, Grady, the widow with her old song, and wondered if any of them stood somewhere, looking at those distant lights, searching for something like you. You knew you'd get no answers, but you knew one thing for sure. Seattle didn't forget you, didn't forget the shadow you left, the scratches on your soul, the shattered dreams you once held. But it didn't remember you the way you'd hoped, not with respect, understanding, or praise. And that was your fate, to live in remembered oblivion, to exist in the vague space between presence and disappearance. You left the waterfront, walked through the city's darkness. The streets stretched endlessly, the lights glowed faintly like dying candles, but in your heart, that tiny flame still burned, holding the last fragment of an incomplete but unyielding life. And with that flame, you kept moving forward, not knowing where you'd end up, not knowing if anyone waited at the road's end. But you knew, forgotten or misremembered, you were still part of Seattle, inerasable, though invisible, though rejected. And that was the end, or perhaps the beginning of your story, the one never truly named, but never fully vanished from this city of shadows and dim light. The story of an opium addict's harrowing fate in 1897. Seattle is not just a dark portrait of an addict's life in a city full of oppression and injustice, but also a reflection of the lasting consequences of society turning its back on those pushed to the margins. From the grim scenes of dark opium dens, police as merciless hunters, to oppressive rehab camps with leather straps and prayers, the story reveals the complexity of confronting and addressing addiction. Today, in the United States, though society has progressed significantly in viewing addiction as a public health issue rather than just a crime, many details of this story remain strikingly relevant. For instance, the isolation of addicts, societal prejudices, and a legal system that sometimes still turns addicts into hunted prey rather than truly helping them. The greatest lesson is the need for a comprehensive, humane, and deeply empathetic system of care, avoiding punitive and discriminatory methods. Look at the protagonist's suffering, abandoned by society, to the point of losing identity, living as a shadow in their own city, to understand that every person deserves a chance at recovery, to be treated with compassion and respect. Don't let addicts be just the last parasite or a living corpse in the new city, but individuals who can be restored, reintegrated, heard, and healed. Promote policies and programs that are practical, focused on mental health and social recovery, to reduce the repetition of such heartbreaking stories in modern times. This is a powerful reminder of our societal responsibility to the most vulnerable among us. If you found this bitter tale of fate meaningful, please hit subscribe to not miss the next raw and profound journeys. Thank you for joining me. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring untold stories of real life out there.